house builders, decision makers, policymakers getting up in the morning and not knowing which way the wind's going, so, and that again stops investment decisions, it stops consumer spending. Construction has to come back. The demand is there, both from kind of the public sector, infrastructure, and the commercially sensitive sectors of residential and, everything else.
Hello and welcome to our second episode of Build Up from the Basement, our podcast at the FMB. I am Iona and I'm joined here with Jeremy, our usual guest on the programme, the Head of External Affairs. Hello Jeremy, how are you?
I'm all good.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our special guest today is Tom Hall, our Chief Economist at Aqua Consultants.
How do you think everything's going to go?
Yeah.
That's a big question.
Well, it is a big question.
What's
Predictions.
how are the builders going to fare?
Well, I think
What are we looking at?
I think in the short term, at least, it's probably more of the same, which is more uncertainty, unfortunately. So I think I felt I'm certainly guilty of maybe slightly rose-tinted spectacles with the new government coming in and what have you, that there was going to be an immediate unlocking of more funds, and a bit of that uncertainty that's dogged us through the previous administrations with Brexit and obviously through COVID, and then the recovery from COVID and all the uncertainty coming out of that, Ukraine war, all that kind of stuff. Before the election, the US election recently, it kind of felt like politically things were going to be a bit more stable for a while. And I think what we saw obviously was the kind of pessimism over the end of last year, the kind of bad news that was affecting both businesses and consumers. They held back spending, and that obviously led to a bit of a slowdown towards the end of last year. And we didn't see that unlocking that I was expecting, at least.
Yeah. Do you think the trade stuff's going to upset the industry?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
a lot of tariffs going on.
Well, I think yes and no, I think is the answer. So probably good news, for me at least, obviously with the US declaring trade war on the world in the last few weeks, construction is probably going to be less impacted by those tariffs than most, because majority of construction materials are sourced domestically, or at least from kind of near neighbours.
So we're not going to America's bring in loads of sort of wood and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Obviously, there will be areas that are affected. So where there are, if your business does import a lot from America, then that is obviously a real concern, massive concern, immediate increase in cost and immediate disruption in supply chains. I think, but there are, for construction and generally the UK, there are potentially some upsides from all the tariff wars. So obviously the EU now has an incentive to have more trade with us, which it didn't have before. Before it was always us going to the table, realistically. So they've got, they want to alleviate the impacts of trade. Easy to do it with us because obviously we want that trade and we're nearby. And then also surplus of Chinese products potentially will be looking for a home. And that, so potentially there might be some downward inflationary impacts, which again will benefit us. So that's another positive that doesn't get
cheap?
well,
Or
less
is that
inflation
less
rather
inflation,
than
right?
deflation, shall we say?
Deflation,
I would say.
yeah.
So just inflation might be slightly lower as a result of increase.
cool.
That we might have more goods kicking around.
But the problem isn't it, is investment into housing and that's the problem is are people not wanting to buy here?
Yeah, so the negative, I think, is that continuation of uncertainty that we've seen. So, house builders, decision makers, policymakers getting up in the morning and not knowing which way the wind's going, so, and that again stops investment decisions, it stops consumer spending. That uncertainty and that continuation of high levels of uncertainty is the biggest risk for all sectors, and construction is obviously, not also being highly cyclical industry. It's highly sensitive to those kind of winds.
Is there anything? Is there like not quite a silver bullet? Is there something you would like to see the government do? Is there a few little changes that could be made?
I mean, they've already said, sorry, just quickly, that the trade deal with the EU is more important than the one with America. So
Exactly. Yeah.
Seriously, I mean, that's one of them, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, I think they are doing quite a few things which are net positive, I think, but it all takes a long time to come in. The legislation that they were elected on is only starting to go through the House of Parliament now, and then it takes time to come in. So, really you're talking 2 years before a government can really make any legislative changes, and then they've got to bring in and they've got to bed in and what have you. So, I think, I think, there's good some really good things, so potential for longer term strategies, hopefully that have cross-party consensus as well, is really positive. So. Planning reform, potentially unlocking some of the barriers to housing on the supply side, probably a lack of labour market reform in terms of, obviously the supply constraints in terms of labour, not much material being done there as far as I'm aware, and just generally kind of pro-growth, long-term growth things of investing more in public investment, that kind of longer-term view and borrowing and investing for the long term.
Sorry, just really quick. It's interesting that Rachel Reeves, and I know it was ages ago, but was going build. This government is, but I mean, builders are not not brickies and all that. That big announcement we had recently. They're not often mentioned with government. I can't remember the last time a sort of conservative government in 40 years. They haven't mentioned it at all. It's quite interesting that they are becoming the backbone of the economy, and the pressure is on to build. But then people don't understand. Do the builders help the economy, or do the economy need to build? It's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? When you see cranes outside, for example, it's like, economic growth, but which one?
Yeah,
first, you know what I mean?
It's a difficult one because it's always chicken and egg. They need the incentives to go, often train up the workforce, which is the difficult part. So and we've seen with retrofitting and energy efficiency in homes, there needs to be that consumer incentive. And I think, as Tom was saying, it's that stability of the economy. If you're going to invest tens of thousands in your home, you need a stable economy. You need to know there's, you're going to have money in your pocket at the end of the day. So so difficult time.
Yeah. So kind of doom and gloom. Not doom and gloom, but continuation of I think uncertainty and somewhat depressed, conditions for the short term. Yeah. But I think there are a few positives, maybe not coming through in the leading indicators, but for me the big one is the fact that wage growth has been 3% above inflation, so real growth about 6% nominal, 3% real for 12 months now, and that is hopefully, it is lessening the squeeze on household incomes a bit after the longest ever, I think it was the longest ever continuous fall in real incomes, which is really bad. So that's a real positive, but that's not feeding into spending yet, because saving rates have increased. They're almost at levels which we saw at the peak of the 2008 financial crisis. Okay. So we're almost at that level again, and that's not going to continue forever. So at some point, consumers are going to go, hold on, I'll start spending. I'm happy with the level of savings I have now. I can start spending, and maybe I've got that deposit together for the house that now. Coupled with that, we're going to see, almost certainly see, the Bank of England starting to reduce their base rate. The markets think 3 further percentage point falls this year. So, we're not coming back, and we won't come back to the kind of ultra low rates, but, a more kind of long-term average rates over the next couple of years, you'd hope.
Because people got used to those low rates, very low rates of 1-2%, which, underpinned the last 20 years, 15 years or so.
And I think demand for housing remains very high. So many people wanting to move but aren't able to. So that underlying demand that I've been talking about for a long time remains there. It's just obviously, people want to move but they can't afford it at the time. So, that lessening of constraints to household income, slightly more increasing availability of finance, I think hopefully should increase demand. And on the supply side, your planning reform, and hopefully a bit more kind of hopeful, stable conditions domestically.
Do you think it's this? Do you subscribe to the idea that it's going to be a bit of pain for 2 years, and it was always the plan in government, painful 2 years, and then as the election starts to ramp up, and the sort of bit people remember from a government, because they don't normally remember the first 2 years, then they start to turn the taps on. Bit more money starts to trickle out, or do you think world events have caught up with them, and that's
do you think they're not
that was a nice idea?
Yeah.
I think every government generally that's the strategy for every government. Start with the pain, and then some giveaways towards the end of the parliamentary term to trying to get re-elected. I think is maybe a bit less cynical than it has been recently, in that I think there's broad cross-party recognition that something needs to be done, parties probably differ about what those things are. But I mean, my personal view is that, the things that, the increased borrowing in the last budget was definitely worth it to start the green transition properly. There was a lot of things in there that I kind of agreed with. I think we're still lacking a real retrofit strategy, for example, which is going to need a lot of
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah,
Talking of green stuff, we've obviously had the news out today, so I think we should mention it, that basically builders are going to have to put solar panels on roofs. I mean, this is something Jeremy said, they've been sort of batting with this idea for a long time. But I mean, if they were forced to do that, what would that mean for the economy and the housing market and everything? Do you know what would that mean for someone who can go and buy? If they were forced to do that.
Certainly good for solar panel manufacturers and the installers of them, which is good because that's absolutely right and should be the case. I mean, personally, I bought a new build last year with solar panels on, and I've really benefited from that.
Have you?
When it's sunny in Scotland, on the one day a year when it's sunny, I've got a gas boiler as well, and a gas boiler hardly ever works when it's sunny. Truly it's impressive.
Wait, how much do you reckon you've saved? If you mind asking, you'd have to reveal.
I absolutely no idea.
Is it like 30 quid or 5 quid? That's a big difference.
I don't know, probably a few $100.
Oh, nice.
Okay,
What's the
so
system?
enough for you to notice.
Over the year? Yeah.
Did you have like a battery, or is it straight to?
No,
straight
but
to
that's the next stage.
Nice.
But yeah, I think I don't know. I don't know enough. My inclination, and maybe I'm an outlier because maybe I'm slightly more environmentally conscious than your average UK consumer. But I feel like there's an opportunity for builders to offer offer kind of more in that area, and I feel like a lot of consumers are ready for it.
I think
I
certainly,
don't know.
yeah.
The consumer messages can be a bit mixed.
It can be,
pumps and stuff,
but that
so-
tends to be how the smaller builder, particularly our members, do differentiate themselves, offering that slightly more.
They know. more about-
They know more about that technology. They offer it to the consumer. They've got to differentiate themselves from the sort of large site, down the road with 1,000 homes. They've got to start offering that sort of technology, and they do. And they've known about it for years. I mean, some of our members have been putting heat pumps in long before they were fashionable, 15, 20 years ago. Yeah.
Okay.
Because that's what consumers wanted
Yeah.
at the time, and it was a selling point. You can save money, even though electricity prices are the way they are. But
Yes.
And the cost equation has changed, hasn't it? With with the increases in energy prices resulting from our reliance on fossil fuels, the equation that is kind of like in your mind, it's like, well, my payback's going to be 20 years. It's not, so it's never going to be economic. That's not the case anymore. And both the lowering of the prices of renewables, in domestic renewables that you can install, and the increase in price in grid electricity.
yeah, do you think the prices on electricity will come down? Because I'm thinking about the green transition, very reliant on obviously a stable grid, actually being the power there in the first place, but costs are very high.
Well, that's the
Yeah.
problem
Yeah.
generally you have you've got to pay for that investment. If you look at France, for example, they're at the opposite stage. They're highly reliant on nuclear power, but all their nuclear power is coming to the end. So they've got an incredibly low unit rate of electricity but at some point they're going to have this bow of investment when all their nuclear power is already starting to need to come offline and be replaced with something. So they're in a completely different stage. So it's quite hard to make
Which is
international
better, where we are or
comparisons.
where they are?
I don't know enough about the French electricity market, I would say. But I think the UK's done pretty well in terms of decarbonising with the lack of policy certainty, and the kind of moratorium on various different forms of renewables and lacking subsidies and all that kind of stuff.
Well, it's a really contentious issue, this net zero stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it always comes up.
Yeah.
Literally over the weekend.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, more of it.
Kicking off about it, saying,
Yeah.
the van was saying he doesn't do it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, until Tony Blair coming out with the reports.
That's right, sorry, that's right. And lots of
there's
them.
not invested enough, not gone hard enough, all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, not great.
Yeah.
So, Jeremy, we have had the news today about solar panels. You were quite funny upstairs when I asked you about this earlier. You were like, yeah, they always talk about this. Can you actually just tell our listeners, please, what the news is?
Yeah, so it looks like they are finally going to make a decision on solar panels being put on all new homes by 2027. I think this has been in the Future Home Standard. They've been talking about this for a very long time. It's kind of been in the pipeline. I think, Tom's mentioned about having it on his own home, and it works very well, and it probably just needs to be integrated into bigger things. So like actually capturing the energy in batteries and things like that. That's another area that's been spoken about and hasn't quite advanced enough. Battery technology is there, but are they going to put batteries in new homes, all this sort of thing? Because then you're actually capturing the energy, you're putting it back into the grid, or you're putting it back into your own home, and it's much more beneficial for the homeowner. So I think it needs to be part of a bigger strategy potentially in terms of energy capture, rather than just solar panels on homes, which will be good because it will save people money.
That's a really people I don't think know that. That's about another thing about sort of, people being they're not informed enough. I didn't know that you could sort of stash the battery.
Yeah, you can. Well, that's the idea. That's the idea. Especially as people are charging their cars and they're going to have electric heating through heat pumps, etc. It's going to put a lot of strain on the grid. So if you have that battery power stored up in your own home, can save you money. It takes the effort off the grid, so it works out better for everyone. But that's sort of the next stage, I think, that sort of battery storage capacity in homes.
Okay, and I want to ask something else about, do you not think that we should be focusing on businesses rather than new homes? The government should be focusing on solar panels? Or do you think new homes, that's definitely the way to go?
Well, I think if you're going to build 1.5 million new homes, or try at least attempt to, or then scale back on that each year incrementally, and then pretend probably it never existed. But that's me being cynical. No, but if you're going to build that many homes, or the ambition is, then that's a lot of roof space to cover with something that's going to capture energy. So yeah, I think it does make sense.
Okay,
yeah,
it's the right time.
Yeah, definitely the right time.
And obviously, it's great news for, as you said, Tom, people with solar panels. I'm just seeing if there's anything else I want to ask you on it. I mean, we're looking at 2027. Again, this goes back to what Tom was saying about how, it takes a while to get all this stuff going. Is it going to be a little bit too late or what?
Well, no, I think all policy does. And particularly, I think it's very helpful for smaller builders. The reason being is that what you might see is when this comes into force, the prices of solar panels will absolutely leap up because you'll have lots of the volume builders buying up stock. So if there's a transition period for smaller builders, that would be extremely helpful, because then when they're buying from their suppliers, which are much more small scale, often straight from merchants, they're not buying straight from supply chain and manufacturers. So actually time is beneficial to a small house builder. So it's all good.
Right, interesting. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Jeremy.
Cool.
Is there anything else that we need to add, do we think? Is there anything else we want to ask Tom?
While he's here.
I guess if I could summarise.
Yeah,
so
please do.
Obviously continuation of uncertainty, probably this year, for the end of this year. But, I think construction has to come back. My view is that it has to come back. The demand is there, both from kind of the public sector, infrastructure, and the commercially sensitive sectors of residential and, everything else. But it's going to be kind of slow and steady comeback. Obviously, with the supply constraints of lacking labour as well, the lack of labour shortages, or at least labour constraints, shall we say? So it's going to be slow and steady return, I would say, rather than a kind of immediate unlocking and big bang type stuff.
I think while you're here, it'd be interesting, though, because there's this constant argument raging that does construction need to innovate,
right,
or is it just expansion? And I think a lot of industries are in that space. But while you're here, is it a case of, because construction, I think output wise hasn't really increased for a number of years, possibly decades. So is it a case of we need to look at innovation? Is everyone getting excited about AI? Is that the right thing to do? Or
I want to play you onto this, but just to give you some information, when Brian and I went to a Polish builder consortium last week, and we were talking about exactly this. And there was a gentleman who has his own company, and he was saying how basically AI is like overtaking the young generation coming in are learning all this really, really quickly. Yeah. And they're sort of going off with their AI skills and and it's just sort of overtaking. And the older generations who are working for these companies aren't sort of keeping on board. And then you get this big divide of sort of the workforce splitting of the young people coming in and sort of advancing in other ways. And it's all a bit quite intimidating, I think, for some of these companies taking on this stuff.
Well, I can understand. I mean, if you're a small company, I mean, maybe AI on whether or not you take your cranes down or not and the time of moving them around. Because really, they probably just need finance software or something. It's that kind of thing to help them just with the back end. But you don't need these big picture kind of modelling data and all this stuff. Because I think there is maybe a little bit, we're getting a bit carried away with that potentially in some areas, because most of the industry is small builders. It's probably small incremental changes, just to sort of back end changes on their, accountancy software or something that used to happen. But
Rather than, like, massive things.
I mean, back to that point there. I mean, do you think it's going to become a larger part of the economy? Do you think it's got the potential to do that with all the ambition behind it? Do you think that's beneficial to become a larger part of the economy as we're so service-based? Or
I think in terms of larger part of the economy, I guess, given that we're talking about, there needs to be a bow wave of investment, particularly in energy, it makes sense to believe that it will, certainly for a period of time, become a bigger part of the economy, because we've let our public realm and infrastructure degrade over the last 30 to 40 years. So you'd naturally think that there should be an increase required in construction, because improved built environment provides the growth impetus and provides healthy people, creates healthy people, creates healthy societies that we need. And I feel like we've got away from that a bit in the last kind of couple of decades, maybe. So yes, I think it should be. I'd hope, in terms of what's the kind of blockers are, I think like it's such a complex issue, right? So I think the kind of structure of the industry is kind of so complex and interacts with the policy world so much and everything else, that I think you just need to start unpicking some of those difficulties. So why is construction so cyclical? Because margins are so thin, because the power isn't, there's a kind of asymmetry of power across, from who owns the land to who wants to build the stuff to who actually builds it. And the industry is driven from that, so all of the kind of boom and bust of all the construction companies going, that's a function of the market structure that we have. So we need, policy plays a massive part. We need that stable policy, we need that stable long-term investment, cross-party agreement really of higher levels of investment for a longer period. I think we need to also start thinking, and in my view, Mr. Radical, start thinking more about land use and how we change incentives for using land differently, and how we tax that land differently over the longer term. All that kind of stuff, it needs some answers to some bigger questions, I think. And technological naturally play a massive part, but I think that the underlying issues with construction kind of go beyond technology. We talked about off-site construction for a long time. It's come a long way, but it's not gonna. There's no silver bullet. There's no one thing. It's not AI. It all plays its part to improving. But I think policy-wise and market structure-wise, we need to take a kind of more of a strategic look and long-term look.
Absolutely.
Brilliant, Tom.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
We will hopefully have you back when we have our next.
Can't wait.
And a great tie, by the way.
Thank
you very much.
Yeah, great tie.
Thank you.
That's a great tie. I didn't know so. Great tie. And talking of cross-party, we have got next week, we are bringing in we are bringing in an MP from the Conservative Party who is going to be talking to us about licensing. So there's a spoiler for next week. Tom, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much to all of our listeners who have been listening into this podcast today. And we also want to obviously say a big thank you to Tom for coming all the way into the office in EU Place. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. Hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Look forward to it.
Thank you. Brilliant. And Jeremy, obviously, thank you very much.
Yes, I just had to come downstairs.
I will see you upstairs in literally 5 minutes. And join us for our next one, where we'll be talking about licensing.